The containment alarm shrieked through the outpost at 0347 hours, and Commander Kael'thas knew immediately that something fundamental had broken. 3 Vexthul cubs detected in Sector 7 residential zone. The tactical officer reported, voice clipped with barely controlled panic. Biological weapon protocol activated. Evacuation alert issued. All civilian personnel are being directed to emergency shelters. According to YouTube analytics, 99.3% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. Kael'thas was already moving toward the containment bay. 3 cubs, juvenile Vexthul. Nothing in the known galaxy was more dangerous than a young apex predator separated from its pack. Mindless predatory instinct, unfiltered by any vestige of civilization or restraint. The Vexthul themselves had classified their juveniles as biological weapons after the incident on Corvin Station. Nobody argued with that assessment. Not anymore. Deploy full containment team, Kael'thas commanded. Combat armor, tranquilizer protocols, energy barriers. I want this locked down before... Sir, there's a problem. The tactical officer interrupted. Civilian Smith isn't responding to evacuation orders. Of course there was a problem. Where is she? Sector 7, quarters 2847. She's not leaving. 20 seconds later, the containment team was suited up and moving. 6 operatives in combat-grade exoskeletons, weapons charging with a sound like distant thunder. Kael'thas followed 2 steps behind, every sensor in the corridor screaming critical status. They burst through the residential corridor at a controlled run, boots synchronized, weapons raised. The residential zone was eerily quiet. Every other door sealed, every other occupant already in shelter. Sector 7 was supposed to be empty, except for the threat. Quarters 2847 was not what Kael'thas expected. The door slid open, and instead of screams or carnage or the sight of a human being methodically consumed, he saw Olivia Smith sitting cross-legged on her bed, surrounded by blankets, laughing softly. 3 Vexthul cubs were nestled against her, small enough that 2 of them fit against her torso, 1 draped across her lap. Their scaled hides were a deep blue-gray, their breathing synchronized with each other, and they were making sounds, soft, rhythmic chirps and clicks, that were absolutely not consistent with aggressive hunting behavior. They were purring. Guys? Olivia looked up at the 6 armed operatives stacking in her doorway, her expression somewhere between amusement and bewilderment. They're asleep. And I think, are they purring? Is that what that noise is? Step away from the biological weapons now, the containment lead barked, weapon rising to targeting stance. Olivia didn't move. She just smiled. Actually smiled. And carefully shifted her hand to rest on the smallest cub's head, stroking along its scales in a gesture that was so casually tender it made Kael'thas's threat assessment protocols stutter. Yeah, no, Olivia said conversationally. I don't think so. Civilian, they will shred you apart the moment you show weakness, the lead operative said. But there was uncertainty in the transmission now. The operative's weapon was still raised, but the targeting laser wasn't active. Step away, now. That's not a request. Olivia didn't even glance at the operative. She was looking at Kael'thas instead, her eyes calm and oddly knowing. They showed up about 15 minutes ago. They were scared. Really scared. They climbed into my bed and just hid under the blankets. She paused, tilted her head. I'm a custodian. I clean things. I'm not exactly trained in xenobiology. But scared is scared. So I let them stay. She said it like it was the simplest thing in the universe. Like she wasn't sitting 3 meters away from 3 juveniles that were classified, officially, universally, across the entire documented galaxy, as mindless predatory weapons. Kael Thas stepped forward. Olivia Smith, you are directly violating emergency protocols. You are probably keeping them alive, Olivia interrupted gently. And when Kael Thas looked at the cubs again, really looked at them, he saw what Olivia had already understood. They weren't hiding because they were hunting. They were hiding because they were terrified of something else. And they had chosen this human's bed because somewhere in the evolutionary algorithms of a Vexthul cub's panic-stricken brain, a soft thing and a warm thing and a thing that didn't hurt them meant safe. Kael Thas had no protocol for this. The containment team didn't lower their weapons. They couldn't. Every tactical display, every behavioral model, every classified database screamed that what they were witnessing was impossible. Olivia Smith sat on her bed with 3 Vexthul cubs draped across her like she was a piece of furniture they decided to claim ownership of. One was wrapped around her forearm, its tail gently coiled around her wrist. Another was pressed against her ribs, its scaled head resting against her shoulder. The third was curled in her lap, and Olivia was, absurdly, impossibly, stroking its spine like it was a common house pet. "Anyone want coffee?" Olivia asked, entirely unbothered by the weapons trained on her position. "I just made a pot. Real coffee, not the recycled stuff from the break room." "Stand down from the civilian," Kael Thas commanded, and the containment team lowered their weapons fractionally, a compromise between protocol and the evident reality that nothing here matched their threat parameters. "Olivia, I'm ordering you to step away from those entities." "Yeah, that's not going to happen," Olivia said, reaching for a blanket that had fallen to the side of the bed. She pulled it back up, carefully tucking it around the cubs with the precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. One of the cubs made a soft clicking sound and pressed deeper into the blanket nest. "They're scared. Moving them is going to make that worse." "Heat signature, analysis complete," the tactical officer reported, and Kael Thas heard the confusion in his voice. "Sir, the readings show they're not elevated. All 3 specimens are registering baseline relaxed temperature patterns, equivalent to pre-sleep state." That wasn't possible. Juvenile Vexthul in unfamiliar territory should be showing aggressive temperature spikes, predatory metabolic acceleration. Their entire evolutionary profile was built on hair-trigger aggression. "Pheromone readings?" Kael Thas demanded. A pause. Then, "Sir, the analysis shows submission markers, comfort-seeking response markers. There's trace cortisol, but it's dropping, not climbing." "Impossible," Kael Thas breathed. But he was already seeing it with his own optics. The cub's scale patterns were softer than any Vexthul he'd ever observed. Their ridging relaxed instead of raised. Their pupil dilation normal instead of predatory dilated. And they were choosing to remain in contact with a human. They weren't trapped. They were nesting. "I'm calling Dr. Sinara," Kael Thas said into comms. "Emergency priority." 15 minutes later, the xenobiologist arrived with a full diagnostic kit, her mandibles clicking with agitation. She immediately began scanning the cubs, her instruments registering data that made her freeze in place. "This can't be accurate," Dr. Sinara muttered, running the scan again. "The cortisol levels they're dropping. They're actually entering REM sleep state. That's not possible for predatory juveniles. Their threat response should prevent..." She looked at Olivia, then at the cubs, then back at her scanner. "What did you do?" "I gave them a blanket," Olivia said simply. She was yawning now, her head tilted back against the wall. And I didn't stab them with anything. That probably helped. You're exhausted, Dr. Sinara observed, though it sounded like an accusation. Night shift maintenance, then 3 Vex-Thul home invaders, Olivia confirmed. Another yawn splitting her face. Yeah, I'm pretty tired. You know what's not possible? Me staying awake for another 8 hours while everyone decides if these kids are weapons or like actual kids. They're not kids, Kael'thas said, but even he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. They're classified threat-level entities, biological weapons. Right, and I'm classified as untrained civilian, Olivia replied, opening one eye. Yet here we are with your threat-level entities in my bed, sleeping like they haven't slept in days, while your entire containment protocol is standing around confused. Maybe your classifications need updating. Dr. Sinara ran another diagnostic, her instruments whirring softly. If I didn't know better, I'd say these cubs were traumatized. Separated from their pack, probably. The behavioral markers are consistent with juvenile Vex-Thul under extreme duress. She looked at Olivia with something approaching respect. Your instinctive response was optimal. You provided a safe nesting environment, reduced external stimuli, and established physical contact comfort. It's textbook trauma recovery protocol for any species. Thank you, Olivia offered. The implications are concerning, Dr. Sinara continued, and now she was looking at Kael'thas. If our entire behavioral database is based on observations of traumatized individuals rather than baseline behavior, we may have fundamentally misclassified. Don't, Kael'thas interrupted. Don't say it. Not yet. But one of the cubs stirred slightly, and instead of showing aggression or predatory response, it just pressed deeper into Olivia's side and made a soft, contented sound that absolutely, definitively, did not match any classification the Vex-Thul High Command had ever issued. Kael'thas had no protocol for this either, but he was beginning to suspect no one did. Dawn broke over the outpost, and Olivia Smith had slept 7 uninterrupted hours with 3 Vex-Thul cubs arranged against her like living quilts. Dr. Sinara had not slept. She'd spent the entire night running analysis after analysis, cross-referencing data, pulling files from behavioral archives that dated back to the first hostile encounter with Vex-Thul juveniles on Corvin Station. The more she looked at the original data, the more her mandibles clicked with something that might have been horror. This is catastrophic, she said quietly, standing in Olivia's quarters as the human and cubs began to wake. The smallest cub opened its eyes first, saw Olivia's face inches from its own, and made a soft chirping sound, a greeting, unmistakably. Olivia smiled and made a similar sound back. The cub responded with more chirps, its tail curling around her wrist in something approximating affection. Dr. Sinara documented it all, her instruments barely steady in her hands. The original behavioral models were constructed based on combat observations, she explained to Kael'thas, who stood in the corridor with a growing contingent of senior commanders, all of whom had been called in for an emergency briefing that was rapidly becoming an emergency everything. Every documented instance of Vex-Thul juvenile aggression occurred during active conflict or perceived threat scenarios. We interpreted their stress response behaviors as baseline predatory nature rather than trauma response. You're saying the weapons classifications are wrong, Senior Commander Varthek said flatly. I'm saying our entire classification system is based on observing terrorized individuals and calling their terror instinct, Dr. Sinara replied. These cubs were abandoned during the research facility evacuation on Vex-Thul Prime. They've been separated from their pack for approximately 72 hours. Every aggressive marker we've documented is consistent with juvenile panic response to isolation and environmental threat. Olivia sat up carefully, making sure the cubs remained nestled in the blankets. One of them was making hungry sounds, soft, almost whimpering chirps. She reached for the nutrition packet stacked on her shelf, opened one of the standard ration bars, and broke off small pieces. The cubs approached the food cautiously, sniffed, and began eating with surprising delicacy. They weren't savaging the food. They weren't competing aggressively. They were eating like hungry children, with an almost civilized restraint that made every senior commander in the briefing feed silent. "They're social," Dr. Sinara whispered. "They're bonding with the food provider. That's not predatory behavior. That's cooperative juvenile behavior. That's trust formation." Kael'thas closed his eyes. "What are you telling me, Doctor?" "I'm telling you that we've spent 300 years building military doctrine around creatures that, when not in active survival mode, are apparently as cooperative and affection-seeking as any mammalian species." Dr. Sinara pulled up data on the wall display. Overlapping graphs, behavioral patterns, neurochemical markers. The cortisol levels prove it. When they were separated and terrified, stress hormones through the roof. Here, with a human, in a safe nesting environment, they're showing oxytocin production, bonding hormones. They're not weapons, Commander. They're children. Traumatized, separated children. This has implications across the entire Vexthul integration protocol, Varthek said. And he sounded less like a commander and more like someone watching his worldview collapse. If juveniles are social and trainable and capable of bonding with non-Vexthul entities, then we've been wrong about everything. Kael'thas finished quietly. Olivia, who had been absently petting one of the cubs while it ate, looked up. "Has anyone considered that maybe predators are just regular creatures when they're not, predating? Like, I don't know much about xenobiology, but I know my cat becomes a completely different animal when she's not hunting. When she's safe and fed. She's just a thing that exists and wants comfort. Maybe your apex predators work the same way." "The human is correct," Dr. Sinara said, her voice carrying the weight of professional devastation. "Our entire classification framework requires deconstruction and reconstruction. I'm looking at 3 centuries of behavioral science that appears to be fundamentally fraudulent." Kael'thas activated the command channel. "This is Kael'thas. Activate Emergency Protocol Delta 7. All Vexthul classification systems are under review. Stand down active containment procedures. I want this information escalated to the High Command immediately." "Acknowledged," came the response. "Escalating to High Command now. They're going to want explanations." "Tell them the explanations are going to take a while," Kael'thas said. He looked at Olivia, at the cubs contentedly eating and leaning against her, at Dr. Sinara's devastated expression as she documented the end of 3 centuries of doctrine. "And tell them we're going to need someone to explain how a human custodian solved what all our behavioral science couldn't." Olivia yawned, stretched carefully to avoid disturbing the cubs, and made a simple observation. "Yeah, I'm going to need a bigger blanket." By midday, Olivia's quarters had become something approaching a sanctuary. Not because she'd planned it, but because word traveled through channels that nobody could fully explain. Pheromone trails, perhaps, or some communication method that science hadn't quite cataloged yet. And more cubs started appearing at the outpost. 3 became 6. 6 became 9. By the time Kael'thas arrived with the High Command delegation, There were 12 Vexthul juveniles nested under what appeared to be every blanket the outpost possessed. Olivia sat in the middle of the mass of blankets and cubs, reading a book, occasionally reaching over to adjust a fold or settle a restless cub deeper into the nest. She looked like she was at peace. The cubs looked like they were experiencing peace for the first time in their lives. This is... High Command Admiral Korthak stood in the doorway, his mandibles slightly slack. This is not what we anticipated. No, Dr. Sinara agreed, running final diagnostics on the group. But it is exactly what the data predicted. Once we accounted for trauma response versus baseline behavior, the model became clear. Vexthul juveniles, when separated from pack structure and frightened, seek containment and comfort. The human provided both. The signal attracted others seeking the same. How did you know? Korthax asked Olivia directly. Olivia looked up from her book. I have a cat, she said simply. Sometimes scared things just need to know they're safe. Didn't seem that complicated. There was a profound silence. Then Korthax sat down, actually sat down on the floor next to the nest of cubs. And something in his posture shifted from military bearing to something more like exhaustion. We've spent 300 years building combat doctrine around a species that just needed to know it was safe, he said quietly. We've built military infrastructure, containment protocols, threat assessments, all based on observing terrified children. He looked at Olivia. You solved a crisis we've been unable to crack for 3 generations by providing a blanket. I gave some scared kids a blanket, Olivia replied. You're welcome. Dr. Sinara pulled up her comprehensive findings on the wall display. Neurochemical markers, behavioral progressions, socialization patterns. The integration is remarkable. Vexthul juveniles are highly social, highly intelligent, and capable of extraordinary bonding with non-Vexthul entities when provided with safe environments. They're not weapons. They're potentially among the most cooperative species we've encountered once their basic needs for security are met. This changes everything about how we approach Vexthul integration, Korthax said, and something in his voice suggested he was still processing the magnitude of what he was saying. Not just juveniles. If this behavioral model applies to adults as well, if aggression is situational rather than innate, then you've been at war with a species that's been trying to tell you it's terrified, Olivia finished. She reached over and stroked one of the larger cubs, which was now drowsing contentedly. Just saying. Kael'thas stepped forward. Olivia Smith, the High Command would like to formally offer you a position as primary advisor on Vexthul juvenile development integration. Your expertise has proven invaluable. Olivia considered this while petting a cub that had wrapped its tail around her wrist. I appreciate it, she said finally, but I'm going to decline. However, I do have a counteroffer. Which is? Korthax asked, sounding almost amused. Fix the linen supply, Olivia said flatly. This is the 3rd blanket I've ruined. I need industrial-grade material, at minimum triple the current allocation, and maybe some kind of washing system that can handle scaled creatures without degrading the fabric. Also, someone needs to explain to procurement why a custodian's budget suddenly needs to include emergency blanket reserves. Korthax actually laughed, a sound like distant thunder. Done. Anything else? Yeah, Olivia said. Coffee, real coffee, not the recycled stuff. Kael'thas moved closer, looking down at the mass of resting cubs and the human in their center, reading her book like this was the most normal thing in the world. Humans continue to exceed expectations through sheer normalcy, he observed. Olivia glanced up and smiled. Best compliment I've gotten all week. Now, Someone want to help me make coffee? We're going to need about 12 cups. The Human Integration Protocol for Juvenile Vexthul Development was officially established exactly 72 hours after Olivia Smith had provided the first blanket. By that point, the outpost was already in the middle of restructuring itself to accommodate a completely different understanding of interspecies relations. The High Command had authorized emergency recruitment of custodians, maintenance workers, and various non-technical personnel from human colonies across 3 sectors. Turns out, janitors understood care routines, comfort structures, and environmental management better than any behavioral scientist with 17 advanced degrees. Within a week, the outpost had become something approaching legendary. Not because of grand protocols or sophisticated new frameworks, but because things actually worked when humans were involved in the design process. A human maintenance specialist suggested that the quarters needed dim lighting and enclosed spaces. Creatures feeling watched got anxious. A human food services worker realized that serving meals at consistent times created security markers. A human housekeeper understood that physical comfort and routine weren't luxuries. They were foundations. Olivia continued her night shifts, moving through the modified quarters with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing this job for years. The blanket arrangements had evolved into something almost architectural. Concentric circles of fabric creating layers of visual security, each layer positioned so a cub could see all potential exit points while remaining enclosed. When a department head asked how she'd known to arrange them that way, she'd simply shrugged. Cats do that, she explained. Snakes do that. Nervous creatures like to see all exits. Basic stuff. The department head had written a 17-page analysis of environmental comfort architecture in juvenile Vexthul socialization. Olivia had not read it. What she did do was continue her job. Cleaning, maintenance, small talk with the cubs, who had started making increasingly complex vocalizations that suggested developing language patterns. She continued to request better linen supplies in her daily logs. She continued to make coffee at the start of her shift and offer it to whoever happened to be monitoring the quarters. And somehow, in the space of 3 weeks, the outpost had gone from a standard diplomatic installation to what personnel from other stations started calling the place where things actually work. The implications rippled outward in ways Olivia never intended. Because if Vexthul juveniles had been fundamentally misclassified, what about the other 47 species currently flagged for reclassification? What about the Korvax, classified as territorial aggressors? What about the genera, designated as non-communicative? What about every species that had spent centuries under doctrines built on incomplete or trauma-informed data? The High Command opened an inquiry into systematic species reclassification. The bureaucratic chaos was extraordinary. Reports were filed and refiled. Committees formed committees. 17 different departments claimed authority over interspecies comfort protocol implementation. Olivia found it absolutely hilarious. They spent 300 years building weapons doctrine. She'd muttered to one of the larger cubs, scratching behind its scaled ridges as it settled into the evening nest. And the solution was, maybe try not being hostile to scared children. The cub made an approving clicking sound. Kael'thas, reading Olivia's night shift logs, noticed something that struck him with the force of revelation. The human's notation was consistent, practical, and completely unaware of its cosmic implications. Night shift complete, all units resting, linen supply still insufficient. OS. No drama, no grand theories, no complex analysis of paradigm shifts or diplomatic ramifications. Just, this needs fixing. How can I help? It was, Kael'thas realized, exactly how humans approached problems. not through elaborate frameworks or theoretical models, but through observation, intuition, and willingness to adjust based on actual results rather than existing doctrine. The Council met in emergency session regarding unexpected human competency in cross-species relations. 37 different species sent representatives to discuss what this meant. How had they missed this? What else were they misunderstanding? What fundamental frameworks might be built on similarly flawed assumptions? Meanwhile, Olivia was making coffee in the quarter's small kitchenette, already planning the next night's blanket arrangement. Mentally noting that the smallest cub preferred the eastern corner of the nest, and that if she positioned 3 larger blankets to create a sort of natural alcove, the little one would probably feel more secure. She hummed while she worked. A simple earth tune, older than any of the species having emergency diplomatic sessions about her competency. To herself quietly, she made an observation that would eventually filter through 17 committees and ultimately become the foundation of a new interspecies relations doctrine. Wonder if anyone's figured out that sometimes the solution is just being nice and paying attention. The universe, in its vast and complicated way, was about to learn exactly that. Because sometimes the most revolutionary solutions didn't look revolutionary at all. They just looked like basic kindness.